5 a.m. on a cold winter day in 1860, Hannah Cowwick, a London maid, stands motionless in a narrow hallway, pressed tightly against the cold wall. She stares sternly at the floor as her mistress walks past, not even deigning to give her a fleeting glance. Hannah has already been on her feet for over an hour, and she will have to stand for another 15 hours without a single chance to sit down on a chair. This is not a punishment for misconduct, but a strict law of the system that transformed the human body into a seamless service mechanism. Are you ready to learn the truth about how this flawless machine of Victorian comfort actually worked? The hidden truth that everyone keeps quiet about lies in the strict physical discipline that surpassed even the harshest military regulations of the time. Victorian society created a unique set of rules in which a person's very position in space determined their social worth. These magnificent mansions functioned thanks to the constant, non-stop movement of hundreds of people along hidden staircases and dark passageways. Information about this rarely makes it into official chronicles, hidden behind the glamorous image of high society receptions and formal dinners. What has been found in old diaries and medical records from that era completely changes our perception of the British Empire's golden age. We are accustomed to admiring the luxurious interiors, complex etiquette, and refined manners of London's high society. However, behind every perfectly served cup of evening tea stood a person deprived of the basic right to rest. These people's reality was strictly regulated by meters of space, seconds of time, and rigid rules governing body posture. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how an ordinary chair became a symbol of the greatest social inequality in 19th century British history. The Victorian era was built on a strict hierarchy of bodies, where physical relaxation was a privilege reserved exclusively for the upper class. A member of high society had the right to sit, lie down, lean against furniture, and change posture in the presence of others. A servant, however, was completely deprived of these privileges, becoming a living instrument obliged to always demonstrate physical readiness for action. Any attempt to lean against a wall or shift weight from one foot to the other was regarded as a gross breach of discipline. The rules of conduct in the house dictated an absolute prohibition on servants using furniture in the presence of their employers. Chairs, armchairs, and sofas were reserved exclusively for family members and their guests, forming a zone of unattainable comfort. A maid or footman was not even allowed to sit on the edge of a stool while awaiting instructions in the study or living room. A servant's body had to remain perfectly straight, with arms at their sides and a straight back, expressing the utmost deference. Such a posture required immense muscular tension, which built up hour after hour throughout the entire workday. The story of Hannah Cowwick serves as a perfect example of how the system consumed a person entirely. She began working in London households in her early youth and kept detailed records of her daily routine. Her diaries reveal a world where the body was viewed solely as a machine for carrying coal, cleaning fireplaces, and washing floors. Hannah describes days when she did not sit down for even a minute, from early morning until late at night. Her physical endurance amazed even doctors, but for her employers, it was merely a standard requirement of the job. It was during this era that the concept of the physical body as the primary tool of labor, requiring constant maintenance, took shape. Employers evaluated domestic servants not only on their skills, but also on their ability to remain upright for long periods without visible signs of fatigue. During the hiring process, special attention was paid to the candidate's posture, gait, and overall level of physical strength. Weakness was considered a sign of laziness, and the need for rest was perceived as insolence and an unwillingness to fulfill one's duties. An employee was expected to lose themselves in their role, leaving their physiological needs at the threshold of the employer's home. Physical discipline was enforced through a strict system of fines and reprimands for even the slightest deviation from the norm. If a butler noticed a footman leaning against a doorframe, immediate punishment followed, up to and including dismissal without a letter of recommendations. The lack of a letter of recommendation meant it was impossible to find a new job. which led to the loss of housing and a means of livelihood. Thus, the ability to stand upright became not merely a matter of etiquette, but a primary condition for survival in a harsh city. The fear of losing one's job forced people to ignore their body's signals and continue working at the limit of their capabilities. The situation was exacerbated by the heavy physical labor that fell on the servants' shoulders, in addition to the requirement to stand. Every day, Hannah Kalvik carried dozens of kilograms of coal up steep staircases to keep the fires burning in her employer's fireplaces. She cleaned carpets, moved heavy furniture, scrubbed stone floors, and carried trays of dishes. Each of these tasks required an enormous amount of energy, but once they were completed, she was not allowed to rest. Instead, she had to resume a straight posture and wait for further instructions from the house manager. Victorian household theorists justified this harshness as necessary to maintain social order. They argued that a servant's relaxed posture undermined the employer's authority and disrupted the hierarchy within the household. Sitting was considered an act of equality, so a servant was always required to remain on a different physical level relative to the employer. This visual distinction reinforced class inequality, making it palpable in every domestic situation. A servant's body served as a constant reminder of their subordinate status and membership in the lower strata of society. The layout of the house was also designed to minimize opportunities for servants to rest. Servants' quarters were usually located on the top floors or in damp basements, accessible only by narrow wooden staircases. These rooms contained a minimum of furniture, often consisting of nothing more than a hard bed and a small chest of drawers. Chairs in servants' quarters often lacked backrests, so that even during a brief meal, workers could not fully relax their backs. The architecture of the building itself functioned as a tool for controlling the bodies of those who served it. It is interesting to note that this practice met with no resistance from the workers themselves, who accepted it as the norm. In her writings, Hannah Kalvik often takes pride in her ability to endure such hardships, viewing it as a sign of professionalism. She writes about her feet, worn raw and bleeding, not with self-pity, but as proof of a duty honestly fulfilled. This deep inner submission to the system made any protests or demands for better working conditions impossible. The system was so powerful that it controlled not only people's bodies, but also their thoughts. I'd be very interested to hear your perspective on this kind of self-sacrifice. What do you think of people who are genuinely proud of their ability to endure such inhuman physical strain for the sake of others' comfort? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion is truly important for understanding the psychology of that era. And we're moving on because the architecture of Victorian London conceals even more astonishing mechanisms of control. Are you ready to descend the dark back staircase and see the house through the eyes of an invisible man? A Victorian mansion was not just a building, but a complex engineering structure divided into two parallel worlds. The master's quarters consisted of wide, bright corridors, high ceilings, and grand staircases with plush carpets. The servants' quarters were a network of narrow, dark passageways, hidden behind secret doors and false panels. These two worlds intersected only at strictly defined moments, requiring the servants to master the art of true invisibility. In his writings on house design, architect Robert Kerr explicitly emphasized the need for a complete separation of these paths. He wrote that the presence of a servant should not offend the master's eyes when there was no immediate need for their services. To this end, so-called black staircases were created, characterized by steep steps and a lack of adequate lighting. Every day, servants carried tons of coal, hot water, and heavy tableware up and down these staircases, balancing in the dim light. It was on these very steps that Hannah Kalvik spent a significant portion of her working hours, making endless ascents and descents. The bell system, implemented in the homes of wealthy Londoners, became yet another tool for controlling space and time. All the master had to do was pull a cord in his bedroom for a bell to ring downstairs. Upon hearing the signal, a servant was required to drop whatever they were doing and immediately rush up the stairs. The interiors of the servants' quarters on the lower floors differed radically from the grand halls in their stark functionality. Stone floors predominated in the kitchens and laundry rooms. While practical for cleaning, they were devastating to the feet. Standing on cold stone for many hours disrupted blood circulation and caused chronic hypothermia in the extremities. Even short breaks for meals took place at long wooden tables without the slightest hint of comfort. At the same time, the temperature in the basement rooms was often extremely low, which exacerbated the physical discomfort. The writer Isabella Beeton, who compiled the definitive guide to household management, described in detail the behavioral requirements in the kitchen. She insisted that the cook and her assistants must remain in constant motion, avoiding any idle downtime. Her book became a veritable Bible for managers, legitimizing the harshest standards of exploitation. According to Beeton's rules, the ideal servant was supposed to be like a clockwork mechanism, operating without glitches or stoppages. Within this framework, physical fatigue was viewed as a malfunction of the mechanism, rather than a natural condition of a living human being. Constant confinement in a closed space without sunlight had a devastating effect on workers' health. In Victorian cities, the problem of a lack of fresh air was particularly acute, and in the basements of mansions, the air was hardly ever refreshed. Servants breathed in fumes from kitchen stoves, coal dust, and dampness, which led to chronic respiratory diseases. Doctors of the time noted widespread cases of lung problems among maids and cooks in London's East End. However, employers preferred simply to replace sick workers with new ones without changing their working conditions. Can you guess how many hours it took just to light all the fireplaces in a large London mansion? In the next chapter, you'll discover the minute-by-minute schedule of a Victorian maid, which will shatter all myths about the ease of domestic work. At 5 a.m., Hannah Calvick had to get up, quickly freshen up, and go down to the dark basement. She wasn't allowed to use hot water to wash her face, since firewood and coal were strictly rationed by the house manager. Her first task was to clear yesterday's ashes from the fireplace grates, taking care not to stir up dust or make noise. Cleaning a single large fireplace took about half an hour of continuous kneeling on the hard stone floor. After cleaning, she had to prepare fresh firewood and haul heavy buckets of coal up to the upper floors. A large house could have as many as 20 fireplaces, and each required daily attention before the owners woke up. Hannah made dozens of trips up the steep back staircase, carrying a load exceeding half her own body weight. By 7 a.m., when many were just opening their eyes, she had already completed a workload equivalent to a full shift for a porter. At the same time, her back had to remain straight, and her movements as inconspicuous as possible to those around her. By 8 a.m., the cleaning of the living rooms and reception halls began, requiring impeccable cleanliness and tremendous speed. The maids had to wash the floors, dust all surfaces, polish the wooden furniture with wax, and arrange the furnishings. All of this was done while bent over or on one's knees, placing enormous strain on the lumbar spine. Wet cleaning involved constantly hauling heavy buckets of water, since there were no running water lines on the floors yet. Every movement was strictly regulated, leaving no time to simply stand up straight and catch one's breath. The first short break came only in the middle of the day, when the servants were allowed to have lunch in the kitchen. The meal lasted no more than half an hour and took place in a tense atmosphere under the strict supervision of the housekeeper. Chairs without backs did not allow them to relax their tired backs, so the rest was rather nominal. Immediately after the meager lunch, the second half of the marathon began, involving preparations for afternoon tea and dinner. The maids set about polishing the silverware, washing the crystal, and preparing the formal dining room to receive guests. The evening hours were the most stressful, as they required the servants' constant presence in the formal rooms. Footmen and maids stood for hours along the walls, waiting for the slightest signal from their employers or their guests. It was during these hours that the prohibition against changing one's posture became a true torture for the exhausted workers. Their bodies would go numb and their muscles would cramp, but their faces had to maintain an expression of respectful readiness. Hannah recalled that sometimes she had to discreetly dig her fingernails into her palms to keep from losing her balance due to exhaustion. After dinner ended and the guests had left, the final stage of work began, consisting of cleaning the dining room and washing the dishes. A huge number of plates, glasses, and cutlery had to be washed by hand in large wooden tubs. Their hands were immersed in hot water containing harsh cleaning agents, which led to chronic skin conditions. This work often dragged on well past midnight, as the kitchen had to be spotless by the time the morning shift began. Only then were the servants allowed to go up to their rooms to get a few hours of sleep before the next round of work. This work schedule amounted to about 16 hours a day, 6.5 days a week, with no holidays. A day off was granted extremely rarely and often consisted of only the afternoon of Sunday. On these rare days off, Hannah preferred to simply lie still, regaining her strength for the new work week. The lack of proper rest led to chronic exhaustion, which employers preferred to simply ignore. To them, a worker was merely a function, a resource that could easily be replaced if they broke down. This endless conveyor belt of labor demanded iron discipline and incredible inner resilience. It is astonishing how the human body is capable of adapting to a regimen that excludes the basic needs for rest and recovery. Hannah Kalvik managed to work at this pace for decades, maintaining a clear mind and a detailed memory of every day. Her diaries are a unique testament to human resilience under conditions of total exploitation and physical pressure. But what were the health consequences of such a lifestyle from the perspective of the medicine of that time? Being on one's feet for 16 hours a day could not fail to take its toll on the human body. Dr. Thomas Hawkes Tanner, a prominent physician of the time, was among the first to systematically document occupational diseases among domestic servants. In his reports, he described the devastating effects of prolonged standing without the ability to relax the core muscles. His research revealed the dark side of Victorian comfort, exposing the true cost of perfectly polished floors and crackling fireplaces. The chief scourge of all Victorian domestic servants, from maids to footmen, was widespread varicose veins. Dr. Tanner noted that constant standing disrupted the flow of blood from the lower extremities back to the heart. The veins became deformed and the varicose knots enlarged, causing heaviness in the legs and difficulty walking in the later stages. Women, forced to wear long, heavy skirts and uncomfortable shoes, suffered from this condition several times more often. For many workers, this condition led to the premature end of their careers and a descent into extreme poverty. The second most common problem was irreversible spinal deformities caused by carrying heavy loads and scrubbing floors. The perfectly straight posture required of servants in the presence of their masters was achieved at the cost of overstraining the back muscles. However, while cleaning, these same people would spend hours in an unnaturally bent position, kneeling on the floor. British doctors documented widespread cases of spinal curvature, chronic sciatica, and herniated discs among young women. The body could not cope with the abrupt transitions from rigid static postures to exhausting physical activity in cold conditions. Medical reports also pointed to serious problems with the knee joints, a condition that came to be known as Maid's knee. This specific condition developed as a result of daily scrubbing of stone and wooden floors without the use of soft pads. Constant friction and pressure on the kneecap led to inflammation and fluid buildup in the joint. Dr. William Ferguson, a London surgeon, frequently encountered patients who could no longer bend their legs. Treating such conditions required prolonged rest, which was absolutely impossible for those working in private households. It is important to understand that the healthcare system of that time was virtually inaccessible to ordinary workers. A doctor's visit was expensive, and employers very rarely paid for their servants' medical treatment. A sick worker would often hide their symptoms until the very last moment, fearing dismissal and the loss of a letter of recommendation. Hannah Kalvik described instances when she continued to sweep fireplaces despite a high fever and body aches. This practice of self-medication and concealing problems led to illnesses progressing to chronic, incurable stages. Interestingly, doctors of the era fully understood the social nature of these illnesses, but were unable to influence the system. In his publications, Dr. Tanner urged employers to allow servants to sit while performing light manual labor. He argued that short breaks would not reduce work efficiency, but, on the contrary, would preserve workers' health for many years to come. However, these medical recommendations came up against a brick wall of Victorian traditions and strict rules of etiquette. The social status of the employer was valued more highly than the physical health of the person who ensured that status. Thus, the Victorian mansion was not only a place of work, but also a place of the slow deterioration of the human body. Doctors merely documented the consequences of this process, powerless to change the very philosophy underlying the treatment of domestic servants. Are you ready to learn how people coped with this pressure and what psychological barriers they erected? What went through a person's mind as they stared at the wall for hours, blending into the wallpaper pattern? To survive under conditions of total control, a Victorian servant had to master the perfect art of social invisibility. This meant not just walking quietly, but completely erasing one's personality in the presence of the household's masters. The servant learned to control their breathing, facial expressions, and line of sight so as not to attract the slightest bit of attention. Ideally, the master was not supposed to notice the person serving them morning tea or clearing away the tray at all. The rule regarding eye contact was one of the strictest in the unspoken code of conduct for domestic servants. Servants were strictly forbidden from looking their employer or the employer's guests in the eye while performing their duties. Their gaze was to be directed at the floor or focused on the task at hand, demonstrating absolute submission. Direct eye contact was perceived as an act of disobedience, a challenge to authority, and a claim to social equality. Hannah Calvick described how she learned to navigate the room by looking exclusively at the toes of the shoes worn by those present. Even more striking was the rule of conduct for a servant upon an unexpected encounter with the master in the hallway. If the servant could not quickly disappear behind a secret door, he was required to turn his back to the wall. This gesture symbolized the servant's complete absence from the space, transforming him into a piece of furniture, much like a grandfather clock. The psychological pressure was exacerbated by a ban on any display of emotion or personal feelings while on duty. A servant was not allowed to look sad, tired, sick, or, conversely, too cheerful or relaxed. Their face was supposed to express only a calm readiness to carry out orders, resembling a porcelain mask. Crying over a letter received from home, or grimacing from physical exhaustion, was permitted only behind the closed doors of one's own room. The system demanded complete emotional sterility so that nothing would disturb the serene atmosphere of the master's household. Another way to relieve psychological tension was to socialize with peers in an area free from the master's control. The kitchen or the servants' quarters became the only places where servants could take off their masks and show their true emotions. Here, far from prying eyes, they could laugh, discuss their master's habits, and complain about their fatigue. This secret social life helped them keep from going mad from isolation and constant lives. The psychological transformation of a person who worked under such conditions for years was irreversible and profound. Many servants, even after retiring or leaving service, retained the habit of keeping their eyes downcast and moving silently for the rest of their lives. Their bodies and minds had been permanently reshaped by the Victorian system, leaving an indelible mark on their personalities. But why did employers themselves consider such rules not merely normal, but absolutely necessary? Can you guess how the famous Isabella Beeton justified this system in her best-selling housekeeping guides? In 1861, Isabella Beeton published a book titled The Book of Household Management. This massive volume instantly became a bestseller and a must-have for every self-respecting Victorian housewife. In her work, Mrs. Beeton described in detail the duties of each member of the domestic staff, creating an ideal model for managing a household. It was this book that cemented the rules of physical subordination, making them an unquestionable standard for all of British society. For Isabella Beeton and her readers, the home was not merely a place to live, but a complex enterprise requiring strict management. She compared the role of the lady of the house to that of an army commander who must maintain strict discipline among subordinates. In this military metaphor, any leniency, such as a servant's right to sit in the presence of the master, was equated with desertion. Beeton argued that laxity among the servants led to chaos, filth, and the moral decline of the entire family. Order in the home was a reflection of order in the state, and that order began with a footman standing up straight. Interestingly, the requirements for servants' appearance and posture depended on their role and workstation within the house. Footmen, who were often in full view of guests, were selected based on their tall stature and impeccable posture. Their bodies served as living decorations, showcasing the family's wealth and status. Therefore, they were forbidden from performing menial tasks. Maids, on the other hand, had to be strong and hardy, as their main work was hidden from prying eyes. The division of labor within the household was dictated not only by efficiency, but also by the aesthetics of visual perception. Mrs. Beeton also insisted on absolute emotional detachment between the employers and their servants. She advised giving orders in an even, calm voice, avoiding familiarity or excessive strictness. The mistress was not to take an interest in a maid's personal life or delve into her health issues. This distance was necessary to maintain authority and prevent any attempts to cross social boundaries. A servant was to remain an instrument, and an instrument cannot be a friend or a conversation partner. Victorian society placed particular emphasis on the concept of cleanliness, which had both physical and moral significance. Cleanliness in the home was achieved at the cost of incredible physical effort on the part of the servants, who spent hours scrubbing floors and polishing silver. The masters, meanwhile, enjoyed the results of this labor, completely isolating themselves from the process of cleaning and dirt. The footman's immaculately white gloves symbolized that the dirty physical work remained behind the closed doors of the kitchen. This visual sterility was the main product produced by the invisible army of workers. This way of thinking was so pervasive that even the most enlightened people of the era rarely questioned it. Charles Dickens, who fiercely criticized working conditions in factories, rarely described the harsh plight of domestic servants in his novels. To society, exploitation within the private home seemed more natural and justified than exploitation in a factory. The home was considered the sacred territory of private life, where neither laws nor social reformers could interfere. This created a legal vacuum in which domestic workers remained completely without rights. Do you think people of that time could have survived if their bodies hadn't found a way to adapt to these rules? Have you ever wondered exactly how the physiology of a person forced to live by Isabella Beeton's rules changed? In the next chapter, we'll see how the anatomy of Victorian workers transformed, turning them into a very special kind of people. What happens to the human body under conditions of constant stress is truly astonishing. The body of a Victorian servant could not simply ignore the 16 hours spent on their feet every day and the immense physical strain. To survive and continue working, the body began a process of profound adaptation, altering muscle structure, gait, and even bone structure. Doctors of the time noted the emergence of a specific body type characteristic only of lower-ranking domestic servants. Their bodies literally adapted to the architecture of the mansions and the strict rules of invisibility, forming a unique occupational pattern. First and foremost, workers developed what was known as the servant's gait, characterized by exceptional smoothness and silence. To avoid disturbing their employers with the clacking of heels, maids and footmen learnt to step not on their heels, but on their toes or the outer edge of their feet. Over time, this led to a shortening of the Achilles tendon and a change in the shape of the calf muscles. A person would begin to glide across the floor like a shadow, even when outside the employer's home or on the street. This distinctive gait unmistakably revealed a person's profession in the London crowd, becoming a social stigma. This adaptation also affected the upper body, particularly the shoulder girdle and spine, which were forced to maintain proper posture. Footmen, required to stand at attention for hours on end, developed powerful back muscles but suffered from a constricted chest. Maids, who hauled buckets of coal every day, developed asymmetrical upper body musculature because they carried heavy loads on one side. In her journal, Hannah Kalvik noted that her right arm had become noticeably longer and more muscular than her left due to constant floor scrubbing. The body was shaped by a specific function, transforming into the perfect tool for performing highly specialized tasks. The ability to endure pain and physical discomfort also reached an entirely different physiological level. The pain threshold among domestic servants was significantly higher than that of members of the middle or upper classes. Hannah describes instances when she burnt her hands on hot coals or rubbed her knees raw until they bled, yet continued working without slowing down. Her nervous system had learnt to block pain signals so as not to interrupt the workflow or draw attention to herself. This ability to ignore one's own suffering was a prerequisite for survival in a system that did not tolerate weakness. Another aspect of adaptation was a change in sleep patterns and the ability to recover in minimal time. Maids who went to bed after midnight and got up at 5 a.m. developed the habit of instantly falling into a deep sleep. Their bodies learned to go through the recovery phases much faster than was required of an ordinary person. Hannah Kalvik could fall asleep while sitting on a hard chair during the few minutes she waited for the water to boil on the stove. This ability to sleep in short bursts without losing concentration upon waking helped her endure 16-hour shifts without days off. Even their sight and hearing had adapted to working in dark hallways and large, noisy houses. The servants had learned to navigate the dimly lit, dark stairwells with ease, avoiding falls while carrying heavy trays. Their hearing became so acute that they could tell which of their employers was approaching by the sound of footsteps or the creak of floorboards. This gave them precious seconds to turn toward the wall or assume a respectful posture. Their bodies became complex sensory instruments, attuned to detecting the slightest changes in their surroundings. But why did these people endure such conditions while other workers were already beginning to fight for their rights? Why didn't the laws that protected factory workers from overwork apply to Hannah Kalvik and 1,000 other maids? Are you ready to learn about the greatest legal injustice of the 19th century, which left domestic workers at the mercy of their employers? In the next chapter, we'll compare life in a wealthy household with life in a smoky factory. While Hannah Kalvik was scrubbing her knees raw in London mansions, large-scale labour reforms were already underway across the country. Factory workers, thanks to strikes and the efforts of reformers, were gradually securing improvements in their working conditions. The Factory Act was passed, limiting the working day for adults and introducing mandatory lunch breaks. However, these progressive laws bypassed the vast army of domestic servants, leaving them in a legal vacuum. The reason for this injustice lay in the legal definition of a private home as a territory free from government interference. Parliament considered a factory to be a public business space where the state was obligated to regulate relations between the employer and the worker. A private mansion, on the other hand, was viewed as a closed family domain, and any intrusion into it would violate the fundamental rights of a British gentleman. It was believed that the relationship between employer and servant was of a personal, patriarchal nature and did not require legislation. As a result, domestic servants found themselves completely defenseless against any demands made by their employers. Surprisingly, it was in factories that workers first gained the right to sit while performing monotonous tasks. Factory inspectors, appointed by the government, ensured that employers installed wooden benches for rest in the workshops. They understood that standing for long periods reduced productivity and led to workplace injuries. At the very same time, in the mansions of the Victorian aristocracy, the right to sit down remained an unthinkable audacity for domestic servants. The factory bench became a symbol of progress, while the absence of a chair in the servants' quarters remained a symbol of slavery. Factory workers had the opportunity to organize into unions, stage strikes, and collectively defend their rights. They could publish petitions and draw the press's attention to the appalling working conditions in mines and textile mills. Domestic servants were deprived of this opportunity due to their extreme isolation and strict control by their employers. Any attempt to unite with servants from neighboring homes was immediately suppressed by dismissal with a blacklisting. Isolation and fear made them an ideal, submissive workforce, incapable of rebellion. Lawmakers justified this situation by claiming that servants' living conditions were supposedly better than those of factory workers. Indeed, servants lived in warm homes, received regular, albeit simple, meals, and wore clean uniforms. They did not risk being caught in the gears of machines, nor did they breathe the toxic fumes of chemical plants. However, this physical safety came at the cost of a complete surrender of freedom, privacy, and control over one's own body. The comfort of the mansion was a trap that slowly sapped one's strength, leaving no visible bruises or injuries. How then was this conflict resolved between the limits of human capacity and the endless demands of the system? How did the day end for a person who had stood on their feet for 16 hours, carrying out hundreds of minor orders? What happens when the invisible mechanism comes face to face with its master in an empty hallway? In the next chapter, we'll return to that very cold London mansion to witness the conclusion of Hannah's endless workday. The secret hidden in every Victorian hallway is revealed only late at night. Let's return to the scene where our story began. 5 a.m. Hannah Calwick stands pressed against the wall, staring at the floor. That moment was just the beginning of an endless cycle in which her body served as a tool to ensure someone else's comfort. Now, 16 hours later, the clock has struck 9 in the evening, but the house is still awake, demanding attention. Hannah finds herself once again in the narrow hallway, but now her body bears the weight of a whole day of non-stop labor. In the evening twilight, she returns with a heavy tray of dishes after a dinner party, balancing herself on the steep stairs. Her calves are cramping, her feet are on fire, and her back aches from constant bowing and carrying heavy loads. At that moment, the master of the house appears on the stairs, heading to his study after finishing his cigar. Hannah must react instantly. She takes a step back, presses herself against the wall, and freezes, blending into the wood paneling. The tray in her hands weighs several kilograms, but she is not allowed to rest it on her knee or against the wall. The owner walks past without slowing his pace or glancing in her direction, as if she were truly a piece of furniture. To him, it's simply the practical layout of the house, where servants don't get in the way or obstruct the passage. For Hannah, this is a moment of extreme physical strain, when she must control every muscle to prevent her hands from trembling. She holds her breath until the gentleman's footsteps fade behind the oak door of the study, and only then does she exhale slowly. This scene is the perfect quintessence of the entire Victorian system, in which one person completely erases themselves for the convenience of another. When the tray is finally delivered to the kitchen, Hannah is given permission to go up to her little attic room. She climbs the last 6 flights of the narrow wooden staircase, clinging to the banister as her legs barely obey her. There is no fireplace in her room. The water in the jug is ice cold and the bed is hard, but it is her only refuge. Only after closing the door behind her does she allow herself to break the rule of keeping her back straight and sinks heavily onto the edge of the bed. At that moment, the mask of deference slips away, and all that remains is a mortally exhausted person. Taking off her stiff boots, she examines her legs, covered in bruises and swollen veins, the very ones Dr. Tanner had written about. She doesn't know the medical terms, but she understands perfectly well that her body is wearing out at an alarming rate. However, she has no time for self-pity, because in a few hours the cycle must begin anew. Tomorrow she'll have to light the fireplaces again, scrub the floors, and turn into an invisible shadow in the hallway. This rhythm of life allows for no breaks. It demands constant movement as long as a person can stand. But every machine breaks down sooner or later, and every era comes to its logical conclusion. A system based on total physical control could not exist forever in a changing world. What happened to Hannah and thousands like her when the new century dawned and new rules of life took hold? Will we ever find out how the story of the army of people who were not allowed to sit ended? At the beginning of the 20th century, the flawless machine of Victorian domestic service began to show its first signs of failure. Changes in the economy, the development of factory production, and new laws gradually eroded the foundation upon which the army of servants stood. Young women from the countryside no longer wanted to work 16 hours a day, preferring the freedom of factory floors. There, they had regulated working hours, the right to rest, and, most importantly, the right to sit down during their shift. Isabella Beeton's strict rules began to seem anachronistic in a world where new technologies and social ideas were rapidly evolving. Hannah Calvick, whose diaries provided a window into this closed-off world, saw her journey through to the very end. She worked in London's brothels for decades, maintaining her remarkable physical strength well into her old age. Her end was not tragic in the conventional sense. She did not end up on the street or die in a workhouse. Her unique experience caught the attention of Arthur Manby, a man from high society, whom she secretly married. However, even after becoming his wife, she often preferred to play the role of a maid, as this had become the essence of her identity. Hannah's journey illustrates just how deeply the system penetrated the human psyche and physiology, changing her forever. She was unable to completely shake the habit of standing perfectly still in the presence of guests or of carrying heavy loads. Her body, shaped by years of strict discipline, simply did not know how to relax in a soft living room armchair. This is the paradoxical outcome of a Victorian worker's life. Having gained freedom, they discovered that the prison remained within themselves. The system of control was so effective that it eliminated the very need for rest. Mansions designed for two parallel worlds stood empty, their black staircases covered in dust. The architecture of invisibility lost its meaning when there was no one left to hide from the master's gaze in the narrow corridors. The tradition of standing 16 hours a day has become a thing of the past, leaving behind only diary entries and old photographs. In these photographs, we see people with straight backs and downcast eyes, frozen in eternal anticipation of an order. They are soldiers of the standing army who served their time and quietly faded into the shadows of history. Today, it is hard to imagine working conditions in which a ban on the use of furniture is a legal and social norm. The right to physical rest seems to us an inalienable, fundamental right of every person, regardless of their profession. But the history of Victorian domestic servants reminds us that the comfort of some is often built on the utter exhaustion of others. This era has left us with an important lesson about how easily society can legitimize physical exploitation in order to preserve the status quo. By studying the life of Hannah Calvick, we learn to appreciate the labor rights that are taken for granted today. The history of Victorian domestic servants is not merely a story of hard labor, it is a story about the limits of the human body. We have traced Hannah Calvick's journey from a cold hallway at dawn to the complete erasure of her own identity for the sake of the system. This invisible army demonstrated remarkable resilience, surviving in conditions where even the right to sit down was considered a luxury. The conclusion of this story shows that any system based on boundless exploitation is ultimately doomed to collapse. Their worn-out feet and deformed backs were the price society paid for the illusion of flawless comfort during the Golden Age. I'd love to hear how this topic resonates with you today and which details of Victorian daily life struck you the most. Please suggest topics for future videos in the comments. What other hidden chapters of history would you like to see on our channel? Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new videos about how people lived, worked, and survived in past eras.